The biting wind whipped at General Anya Petrova's face, a familiar sting that mirrored the frost clinging to her resolve. Her gaze, as sharp and unforgiving as the icy peaks that ringed their training grounds, swept across the assembled ranks. Each soldier stood at rigid attention, a testament to her unyielding discipline, her unwavering demand for excellence. Yet amongst the polished steel and determined faces, one figure seemed perpetually adrift, a smudge on the otherwise pristine canvas of her command. Private Elias Thorne. The name itself felt like a sigh, a concession to a persistent, gnawing disappointment. He was the anomaly, the persistent error in her otherwise flawless equation of military efficiency. His movements were clumsy, his responses slow, his very presence a testament to a fundamental miscalculation in her recruitment process. Anya had long since stopped seeing him as a soldier and instead viewed him as a burden, a constant, irritating reminder of her own perceived failing, the inability to mold every recruit into the hardened, efficient instrument of war she demanded. Her methods with Thorne were not merely strict, they were designed to break, to expose the futility of his ambition, to force a capitulation that would spare the unit further embarrassment. Each public reprimand, each thinly veiled insult, was a calculated strike, intended to drive him from the ranks, to cleanse her command of his perceived weakness. She believed, with a conviction that bordered on certainty, that Thorne was a liability, a drain on resources, a soldier who actively undermined the very principles of courage and sacrifice upon which their nation's defense rested. His continued presence was an affront, a testament to a system that sometimes allowed the undeserving to persist. She saw his uniform not as a symbol of duty, but as a mockery of it. The whispers that followed him, the averted eyes of his comrades, all served to reinforce her own harsh judgment. He was the worst soldier, a label he wore with a silent, almost resigned stoicism that Anya interpreted as stubborn defiance. She had witnessed countless recruits falter, but Thorne's failures were of a different caliber, a persistent, almost artistic mediocrity that defied explanation. He was the soldier she couldn't fix, the one she couldn't inspire, the one who made her question her own formidable leadership. The mission ahead, however, was of paramount importance, a delicate operation deep within contested territory. Failure was not an option, and the weight of responsibility pressed down on Anya with the crushing force of a collapsing mountain. Every soldier was an asset, every piece of equipment vital, and Thorne, in her mind, was a significant deficit. His inclusion on her roster felt like a gamble, a calculated risk she was forced to take, but one she intended to mitigate through sheer force of will and strategic maneuvering. The harsh reality of combat, she believed, would either forge him into something useful or expose his utter inadequacy in a way that would finally silence the dissenting whispers and justify her relentless pursuit of his expulsion. She had no illusions about his capabilities, no flicker of hope for his redemption on the battlefield. He was simply a necessary evil, a cog in a machine that she would, by any means necessary, ensure continued to turn, even if one of its parts was fundamentally flawed. The stark, unforgiving landscape mirrored the internal landscape of her command, a place where sentimentality had no currency, and only the strongest, the most adaptable, the most committed could survive. Anya Petrova embodied that philosophy. Her existence, a testament to a life lived in pursuit of an ideal that Elias Thorne seemed incapable of even comprehending, let alone achieving. The jagged peaks clawed at a sky bruised with the approaching twilight as General Anya Petrova surveyed the treacherous terrain. The mission was a razor's edge, a high-stakes gamble to disrupt enemy supply lines deep within hostile territory. Every soldier under her command was a meticulously chosen instrument, honed and tempered for this singular purpose. Everyone, save for Private Elias Thorne. He was the discordant note in her symphony of war, a constant, irritating imperfection. Anya's gaze, a glacial shard, rested upon him for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, a silent reaffirmation of her disdain. Thorn, as usual, seemed to exist in a perpetual state of mild bewilderment, his uniform slightly askew, his posture lacking the ingrained discipline that defined the rest of her unit. She had made no secret of her opinion of him, her public admonishments a daily ritual designed to chip away at his resolve, to expose him as the weak link he so clearly was. He was a soldier who had, through some inexplicable oversight, found his way into her ranks, and Anya was determined to rectify that error. Her treatment of him was not born of malice, but of a profound, almost visceral sense of duty. He was a drain on resources, a potential liability, a soldier whose very presence undermined the cohesive strength of her command. She believed that by consistently highlighting his failings, by forcing him into situations where his inadequacy was laid bare, she was, in fact, serving the greater good. It was a harsh truth, perhaps, but one she felt compelled to deliver. The desert air, thin and unforgiving, seemed to amplify the silence that always seemed to envelop Thorn, a quietude that Anya interpreted as a lack of spirit, a void where a soldier's conviction should reside. He was the antithesis of everything she valued: courage, precision, unwavering loyalty. He was the embodiment of what she fought against. Not just externally, but internally, the possibility of failure, the specter of weakness. This mission, however, demanded absolute perfection. The enemy was entrenched, their defenses formidable, and the consequences of even the slightest misstep were unthinkable. Anya had meticulously planned every contingency, every movement, every potential threat. Yet, the presence of Thorn cast a long shadow of doubt over her otherwise flawless strategy. He was an unknown variable, a wild card she couldn't control, a persistent low-grade fever in the body of her formidable military machine. She had come to accept his continued presence as a personal challenge, a test of her will, a problem that demanded a solution, however unpleasant. The harsh realities of the desert, she knew, would either forge him into something useful or shatter him completely, providing the definitive, undeniable proof she needed to finally excise him from her command. Her focus remained fixed on the objective, on the preservation of her unit, on the successful completion of a mission that would define her legacy. Thorn, in her eyes, was merely an obstacle to be navigated, a weakness to be managed, a soldier whose potential for failure was as vast and unforgiving as the desert stretching before them. The weight of command pressed down, and Anya Petrova, a woman forged in the crucible of conflict, was ready to face whatever lay ahead, even if it included the persistent, infuriating presence of her most disappointing soldier. The biting wind, a constant companion in this desolate frontier, whipped at General Anya Petrova's face, carrying with it the scent of dust and impending conflict. Her gaze, sharp and unwavering, swept across the assembled ranks of her elite unit, each soldier a testament to her unyielding discipline and relentless pursuit of perfection. Yet amidst the disciplined order, one figure stood out, not for his prowess, but for his profound lack thereof. Private Elias Thorn. The name itself was a sigh, a concession to a persistent, gnawing disappointment that had become a constant undercurrent in Anya's command. Thorn was an anomaly, a soldier whose very presence seemed to mock the rigorous standards Anya had painstakingly established. His movements were clumsy, his responses delayed, his uniform perpetually bearing the subtle disarray that spoke of an inability to master even the most basic tenets of military bearing. Anya had long since ceased to see him as a soldier worthy of her investment. Instead, he was a burden, a constant, irritating reminder of a perceived failure in her own leadership, the inability to forge every recruit into the hardened, efficient instrument of war she demanded. Her treatment of Thorn was not born of malice, but of a deep-seated conviction that he was fundamentally unsuited for the rigors of combat, a liability whose continued presence would inevitably jeopardize the lives of those around him. Each public reprimand, each thinly veiled insult, delivered with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, was a calculated attempt to expose his inadequacy, to force a capitulation that would spare the unit further embarrassment and protect the integrity of her command. She believed with an unwavering certainty that Thorn was a drain on resources, a soldier who actively undermined the very principles of courage and sacrifice upon which their nation's defense rested. His continued presence was an affront, a testament to a system that sometimes allowed the undeserving to persist. She saw his uniform not as a symbol of duty, but as a mockery of it, a costume worn by someone who did not understand, or perhaps could not comprehend, the profound gravity of the oath he had taken. The whispers that followed him, the averted eyes of his comrades, all served to reinforce her own harsh judgment. He was the worst soldier, a label he wore with a silent, almost resigned stoicism that Anya interpreted as stubborn defiance, a passive resistance to the very discipline she embodied. She had witnessed countless recruits falter, but Thorn's failures were of a different caliber, a persistent, almost artistic mediocrity that defied explanation and tested the limits of her patience. He was the soldier she couldn't fix, the one she couldn't inspire, the one who made her question the very foundations of her formidable leadership. The mission ahead, however, was of paramount importance, a delicate operation deep within contested territory, a task that demanded absolute precision and unwavering resolve. Every soldier was an asset, every piece of equipment vital, and Thorn, in Anya's estimation, was a significant deficit, a potential point of catastrophic failure. His inclusion on her roster felt like a gamble, a calculated risk she was forced to take, but one she intended to mitigate through sheer force of will and strategic maneuvering. The harsh reality of combat, she believed, would either forge him into something useful or expose his utter inadequacy in a way that would finally silence the dissenting whispers and justify her relentless pursuit of his expulsion. She had no illusions about his capabilities, no flicker of hope for his redemption on the battlefield. He was simply a necessary evil, a cog in a machine that she would, by any means necessary, ensure continued to turn, even if one of its parts was fundamentally flawed. The stark, unforgiving landscape mirrored the internal landscape of her command, a place where sentimentality had no currency, and only the strongest, the most adaptable, the most committed could survive. Anya Petrova embodied that philosophy, her existence a testament to a life lived in pursuit of an ideal that Elias Thorn seemed incapable of even comprehending, let alone achieving. The stage was set for a mission where the stakes were immeasurably high, and the presence of one profoundly disappointing soldier threatened to unravel everything. The harsh desert sun beat down, a relentless hammer against the parched earth, mirroring the internal pressure mounting within General Anya Petrova. She had reached the refusal of the call stage, not as a soldier hesitant to embark on a mission, but as a leader grappling with a deeply ingrained, almost instinctual resistance to the possibility of Thorn's inherent value. Her entire career had been built upon a foundation of decisive action, of identifying weakness and eradicating it with ruthless efficiency. Thorn, however, represented a persistent anomaly, a flaw in her otherwise impenetrable armor of competence. She found herself actively resisting any notion that his perceived deficiencies might be a facade, or that his presence might serve a purpose beyond her current understanding. This internal conflict manifested as a heightened skepticism towards any unusual occurrence that might, however faintly, suggest a hidden capability within him. Anya's mind, a finely tuned instrument of strategic analysis, recoiled from the very idea that her initial assessment of Thorn could be flawed. It was easier, more congruent with her self-image, to believe that he was simply a persistent mistake, a regrettable oversight in the otherwise flawless machinery of her command. Consequently, she found herself scrutinizing his actions with an even more critical eye, searching for confirmation of her existing bias rather than for any emergent strength. Further compounding this internal struggle was Anya's profound reluctance to accept external validation or guidance that might challenge her established worldview. The concept of a mentor in her experience had always been about receiving direction from superiors, not about finding wisdom in unexpected quarters or from individuals she deemed beneath her notice. The idea of seeking counsel from someone whose capabilities she openly dismissed was anathema to her very being. This created a significant barrier, preventing her from engaging with any potential sources of insight that might offer a different perspective on Thorne's role or potential. Her ingrained self-reliance, a celebrated virtue in her profession, now acted as an impediment, a shield that deflected any information that did not conform to her pre-existing conclusions. She was a solitary figure, accustomed to bearing the weight of her decisions alone, and the notion of admitting that she might need assistance, particularly in understanding the nature of a soldier she so thoroughly underestimated, was a bitter pill to swallow. This isolation, while often a source of strength, now threatened to blind her to crucial truths. Her focus remained rigidly fixed on the immediate objective, the successful execution of the mission and the preservation of her unit's operational integrity. Thorne's continued presence was a low-frequency hum of distraction, a persistent irritant that she was determined to ignore, or better yet, neutralize. She viewed his continued participation not as an opportunity for his growth, but as a risk to be managed, a vulnerability to be contained. Now, consider how this applies when you face a situation where your initial judgment of an individual has been so firmly established that any evidence to the contrary is actively dismissed. Anya's internal narrative was a powerful force, shaping her perception and dictating her actions. She was not simply observing Thorne. She was actively interpreting his every move through a lens of predetermined inadequacy. This created a self-reinforcing cycle where her expectations of his failure became a self-fulfilling prophecy, not because of his inherent limitations, but because of her own unwillingness to acknowledge any alternative reality. The inherent danger of such a rigid mindset, particularly in a high-stakes environment, was not lost on Anya, yet her ingrained habits of thought proved exceptionally difficult to dislodge. Her pride, a formidable shield, also served as a formidable prison, locking her into a perspective that was increasingly out of sync with the unfolding reality of the situation. She was a leader who prided herself on foresight and adaptability, yet in this instance, her own convictions had become a blindfold, preventing her from seeing the potential for unexpected contributions from the most unlikely of sources. This internal deadlock, this stubborn refusal to entertain the possibility of a different truth, set the stage for a confrontation not just with the enemy, but with the limitations of her own perception. A confrontation that would test the very core of her leadership and her understanding of human potential. The desert, in its vast indifference, waited to reveal its secrets, and Anya Petrova, for all her formidable strength, was about to be confronted with a truth she had actively and perhaps dangerously avoided. The relentless sun, a molten orb in the bleached sky, beat down upon General Anya Petrova, amplifying the internal dissonance she experienced. Her meticulously constructed worldview, a fortress built on decades of military discipline and the unwavering belief in her own judgment, was beginning to show hairline fractures. This particular stage of her journey, the crossing the threshold, was not marked by a physical movement into a new territory, but by a subtle yet profound internal shift. She had, in her mind, committed to the mission, but the true crossing, the irrevocable step into a new understanding of her subordinate, Elias Thorne, was still eluding her. Anya found herself increasingly drawn to moments where Thorn's apparent ineptitude was juxtaposed with his silent endurance. It wasn't a dawning admiration, but a growing, unsettling curiosity. She observed him meticulously cleaning his rifle, his movements slow but deliberate, each action performed with an almost ritualistic care that seemed at odds with his general clumsiness. This was not the frantic fumbling of a desperate man, but the focused, unhurried practice of a craftsman. Conversely, she noted how other, more proficient soldiers often rushed through such maintenance, their haste sometimes leading to careless errors. This subtle distinction, a mere flicker in her perception, was the first real tremor beneath the bedrock of her established opinion. Building on this nascent observation, Anya began to notice a pattern in Thorn's interactions with the environment itself. While others navigated the treacherous terrain with practiced efficiency, Thorn moved with a cautious, almost hesitant gait, yet he rarely stumbled, rarely lost his footing. He seemed to possess an uncanny awareness of the ground beneath him, a subtle mapping of the earth that compensated for his lack of outward agility. This was not the confident stride of the skilled warrior, but the grounded, deliberate progress of someone deeply attuned to the immediate physical reality. Furthermore, she began to see how his perceived slowness allowed him to absorb details that others, in their haste, overlooked. During reconnaissance patrols, while the faster soldiers focused on the distant horizon, Thorn's gaze would linger on subtle disturbances in the sand, the unusual placement of a rock, the almost imperceptible break in vegetation. These were not the actions of a soldier disengaged, but of one observing with a different kind of intensity, a quiet vigilance that was easily mistaken for a lack of focus. Consequently, Anya found herself in a paradoxical state. Her ingrained instinct was to dismiss these observations as mere coincidences, further evidence of Thorn's peculiar, inefficient methods. Yet, a part of her, a newly awakened analytical faculty, recognized a consistent thread of quiet competence woven through his apparent shortcomings. This was the true crossing the threshold for Anya. It was the moment her rigid black and white perception of Thorn began to yield to a more nuanced, albeit still reluctant understanding. She hadn't yet accepted him, not by any measure, but she had undeniably stepped across the boundary of her prior certainty. The mission itself, with its inherent dangers and unpredictable variables, was forcing her to reevaluate her assumptions, to question the very definitions of effectiveness she had held so dear. Now consider how this applies when you face a situation where your initial judgment of an individual has been so firmly established that any evidence to the contrary is actively dismissed. Anya's internal struggle was not merely about Thorn. It was a battle against her own ingrained biases, a confrontation with the limitations of her own perception. The desert, in its vast indifference, was becoming a crucible, forcing her to shed the protective layers of her certainty and confront the uncomfortable possibility that her understanding of strength, of capability, was incomplete. The meticulous cleaning of his rifle, the careful navigation of the terrain, the subtle observations of his surroundings, these were not the actions of a soldier destined for failure, but perhaps, Anya grudgingly acknowledged, the quiet preparations of someone who understood his own unique strengths and limitations. This internal recalibration, this subtle yielding of her absolute conviction, was the true threshold she was crossing, a journey into a more complex and potentially more dangerous understanding of the soldiers under her command, and perhaps of herself. The mission had reached its apex, a brutal crucible where General Anya Petrova faced the heart of the ordeal itself. This was not merely a physical confrontation with the enemy, but a profound internal confrontation with her own deeply ingrained prejudices, particularly concerning Private Elias Thorn. Her perception of him had begun to shift, subtly but irrevocably, during the preceding phases. Now, in the face of imminent, life-threatening danger, those nascent doubts were amplified, demanding a definitive resolution. Anya found herself in a precarious position, forced to reconcile the image of Thorn as the incompetent soldier with the emerging reality of his quiet, almost unnerving competence under fire. The enemy's ambush, sudden and vicious, shattered the fragile order of her unit. Chaos erupted, a maelstrom of gunfire and explosions that threatened to engulf them. It was in this maelstrom that Anya's established understanding of Thorn was truly tested. She had anticipated his failure, braced herself for the moment his inadequacy would become a fatal liability. Instead, she witnessed something entirely unexpected. While other, more experienced soldiers faltered under the sheer ferocity of the assault, Thorn moved with a surprising, albeit ungraceful agility. He wasn't a ballet dancer on the battlefield, but his movements, while lacking the polished fluidity of seasoned warriors, possessed a crucial, life-saving efficiency. He instinctively sought cover, not in the most obvious or advantageous positions, but in the spaces others overlooked. The small pockets of relative safety that required a deeper understanding of the terrain's subtle contours. Furthermore, Anya observed Thorn's reaction to the immediate threat, not as one of panicked desperation, but as a focused, almost instinctual response. While others were overwhelmed by the sensory overload, Thorn's actions, though not outwardly heroic in the traditional sense, were remarkably effective. He provided covering fire with a steady hand, his aim surprisingly accurate, a stark contrast to the wild, unfocused bursts of some of his comrades. It was as if the chaos of the ambush had, paradoxically, clarified his purpose, stripping away the superficial awkwardness and revealing a core of unyielding resilience. This was not the confident swagger of a seasoned combatant, but the quiet, determined grit of someone who understood the fundamental mechanics of survival. Anya, accustomed to recognizing bravery through outward displays of valor, found herself re-evaluating her criteria. Thorn's courage wasn't a roaring fire, it was a deep, steady ember, burning with an intensity that belied his unassuming exterior. Now consider how this applies when you face a situation where your initial judgment of an individual has been so firmly established that any evidence to the contrary is actively dismissed. Anya's internal struggle intensified. The visual and auditory chaos of the ambush was a powerful catalyst, forcing her to confront the stark reality of Thorn's unexpected effectiveness. Her deeply ingrained belief in his incompetence was clashing violently with the undeniable evidence of his survival skills and his contribution to the unit's immediate defense. It was a moment of profound cognitive dissonance. She had mentally prepared for his failure, for the moment she would be vindicated in her harsh assessment. Instead, she was witnessing his quiet, unflashy competence, a competence that was proving instrumental in their survival. This was the reward, the seizing the sword, not in the form of a physical object, but in the form of a shattering realization. The sword was the truth, the hard-won understanding that her perception of Thorn had been fundamentally flawed, a miscalculation of monumental proportions. This realization was not a comfortable one. It was a jarring, almost painful unveiling, forcing her to confront the limitations of her own judgment and the potential consequences of her deeply ingrained biases. The harsh reality of the battlefield had stripped away the superficial layers of her preconception, revealing a truth that was both humbling and profoundly significant. Thorn was not the liability she had so vehemently believed him to be. He was, in this critical moment, a vital asset, a testament to an inner strength she had been blind to. This was the turning point not just for the mission, but for Anya herself, a moment where the carefully constructed edifice of her certainty began to crumble, replaced by the raw, unvarnished truth of human potential, even in its most unexpected forms. The brutal efficacy of his actions in the face of overwhelming odds was a stark illumination, a beacon of truth in the disorienting fog of battle. The immediate aftermath of the ambush left the battlefield a tableau of shattered order. General Anya Petrova, dust-caked and adrenaline-charged, surveyed the scene, her gaze inevitably drawn to the figure of Private Elias Thorne. He was not the picture of triumphant survival, no chest puffed out with bravado. Instead, he was kneeling, his back to her, tending to a fallen comrade. Anya had witnessed his actions during the firefight, his steady aim, his uncanny ability to anticipate enemy movements, his quiet efficiency in providing crucial covering fire. These were not the actions of the inept soldier she had so long condemned. This phase, the road back, was forcing Anya to confront the lingering consequences of her skewed perception, the profound ethical and emotional weight of her misjudgment. The enemy had been repelled, but the victory was tempered by a chilling realization. Her own deeply ingrained biases had nearly cost lives, and potentially her own. Building on this unsettling awareness, Anya began to notice Thorne's interactions, not just with the immediate chaos of combat, but with the aftermath. While others were focused on securing the perimeter or tending to their own wounds, Thorne was methodically checking on every soldier, his movements slow but thorough, his expression one of genuine concern, not just professional obligation. He offered a steadying hand to a young private trembling from shock, a quiet word of reassurance to a medic overwhelmed by the casualties. This was a layer of compassion, a quiet empathy that Anya had never associated with his supposed lack of spirit. She had always interpreted his silence as a void, a deficiency. Now she saw it as a reservoir, a deep well of quiet strength and consideration that he channeled into actions rather than outward displays. Furthermore, Anya observed Thorne's engagement with the recovered enemy equipment. While other soldiers were quick to dismiss it or handle it with a degree of casualness, Thorne approached it with a peculiar meticulousness. He carefully examined a discarded enemy rifle, his fingers tracing the unfamiliar mechanisms, his brow furrowed in concentration. It wasn't the curious fiddling of an amateur, but the focused study of someone seeking to understand, to learn, to integrate knowledge. This quiet, almost academic curiosity, applied even in the grim context of a battlefield, was another facet of his character that defied her previous categorization. It suggested a mind that was not merely reactive, but actively analytical, constantly processing and attempting to synthesize new information. Consequently, Anya found herself in a state of profound internal recalibration. The road back was not simply about returning to base. It was a journey through the wreckage of her own assumptions. She had to acknowledge that her condemnation of Thorne had been based on a superficial understanding, a failure to look beyond the obvious and perceive the deeper currents of his character. The near disaster of the ambush had served as a brutal catalyst, forcing her to confront the ethical implications of her leadership. Had her relentless criticism, her public humiliation, contributed to any hesitation or doubt in Thorne when the bullets began to fly? The thought was a corrosive acid, eating away at her self-assurance. Now consider how this applies when you face a situation where your initial judgment of an individual has been so firmly established that any evidence to the contrary is actively dismissed. Anya's entire professional identity was built on clarity of judgment, on the swift and accurate assessment of personnel. Thorne's unexpected resilience and emerging competence presented a direct challenge to this core tenet of her being. The quiet acts of compassion, the focused examination of enemy gear, the steady presence he offered to his wounded comrades, these were not isolated incidents, but rather consistent threads that wove a new narrative about the man she had so thoroughly misjudged. The road back was a stark and deeply uncomfortable lesson in the fallibility of even the most seasoned perceptions, and the potentially devastating consequences of allowing prejudice to dictate understanding. The journey back from the contested zone was a stark and sober affair, a stark contrast to the frenetic energy of the preceding engagement. General Anya Petrova, her face etched with a weariness that went beyond mere physical exertion, found herself increasingly preoccupied with the subtle shifts in her perception of Private Elias Thorne. The near-fatal ambush had acted as an unforgiving spotlight, illuminating facets of his character that her previous disdain had rendered invisible. Now, in the quieter, more reflective phase of the road back, these observations began to coalesce into a more coherent, albeit deeply unsettling understanding. Anya noticed Thorne's quiet demeanor, not as a sign of his earlier disengagement, but as a manifestation of a profound internal processing. He wasn't the boisterous, back-slapping soldier who reveled in shared combat narratives. Instead, he was introspective, his gaze often distant, as if replaying the events not for glory, but for comprehension. This contemplative nature, previously dismissed as a lack of emotional investment, now struck Anya as a sign of deep, analytical thought. He seemed to be dissecting the experience, not for personal validation, but for a more fundamental understanding of its mechanics and implications. Furthermore, Anya observed a peculiar pattern in Thorne's interactions with the recovered enemy equipment. While other soldiers were quick to discard or handle such items with a degree of casualness, Thorne approached them with a peculiar meticulousness. He carefully examined a discarded enemy rifle, his fingers tracing the unfamiliar mechanisms, his brow furrowed in concentration. It wasn't the curious fiddling of an amateur, but the focused study of someone seeking to understand, to learn, to integrate knowledge. This quiet, almost academic curiosity, applied even in the grim context of a battlefield, was another facet of his character that defied her previous categorization. It suggested a mind that was not merely reactive, but actively analytical, constantly processing and attempting to synthesize new information. This deep-seated analytical drive, previously masked by his apparent clumsiness, now presented itself as a unique form of battlefield intelligence, a capacity for understanding complex systems that others, in their haste, might overlook. Consequently, Anya found herself in a state of profound internal recalibration. The road back was not simply about returning to base, it was a journey through the wreckage of her own assumptions. She had to acknowledge that her condemnation of Thorne had been based on a superficial understanding, a failure to look beyond the obvious and perceive the deeper currents of his character. The near disaster of the ambush had served as a brutal catalyst, forcing her to confront the ethical implications of her leadership. Had her relentless criticism, her public humiliation, contributed to any hesitation or doubt in Thorne when the bullets began to fly? The thought was a corrosive acid, eating away at her self-assurance. Now, consider how this applies when you face a situation where your initial judgment of an individual has been so firmly established that any evidence to the contrary is actively dismissed. Anya's entire professional identity was built on clarity of judgment, on the swift and accurate assessment of personnel. Thorne's unexpected resilience and emerging competence presented a direct challenge to this core tenet of her being. The quiet acts of compassion, the focused examination of enemy gear, the steady presence he offered to his wounded comrades, these were not isolated incidents, but rather consistent threads that wove a new narrative about the man she had so thoroughly misjudged. The road back was a stark and deeply uncomfortable lesson in the fallibility of even the most seasoned perceptions, and the potentially devastating consequences of allowing prejudice to dictate understanding. The quiet absorption of information, the meticulous examination of detail, the introspective processing of events. These were not the hallmarks of an incompetent soldier, but rather the subtle indicators of a strategic mind, one that operated on a different frequency, processing the world in a manner that was both understated and remarkably effective. This realization was a heavy burden, forcing Anya to confront not only the limitations of her own judgment, but also the profound responsibility that came with shaping the destinies of those under her command. The desert, in its vast indifference, had offered a harsh but invaluable lesson, one that Anya Petrova, the formidable general, would carry with her long after the dust of the battlefield had settled. The return journey was more than just a physical movement. It was a profound recalibration of General Anya Petrova's understanding of human potential, a stark re-evaluation of her deeply entrenched biases. Having survived the harrowing ambush, she found her thoughts increasingly occupied by the subtle yet undeniable capabilities Private Elias Thorne had displayed under extreme duress. Anya had always prided herself on her ability to discern talent, to identify the raw material of a soldier and mold it into an effective weapon. Thorne, however, had consistently defied her categorization, his perceived deficiencies masking a quiet resilience that was now undeniable. This phase, focused on the resurrection, demanded Anya confront the final, most challenging aspect of her misjudgment, the personal revelation that Thorne was, in fact, her son. This was not merely a professional setback. It was a deeply personal earthquake, shattering the carefully constructed walls she had built around her private life and her military persona. The knowledge, unearthed through a discreet inquiry initiated after the ambush, hit her with the force of a physical blow. Her son, the product of a wartime liaison she had long ago buried beneath layers of duty and emotional suppression, was not only alive but had been serving under her command, an unwitting participant in her harsh, critical gaze. This revelation introduced an entirely new dimension to her internal conflict, transforming her professional assessment into a deeply personal reckoning. The immediate impact of this discovery was a paralyzing shock. Anya found herself replaying every reprimand, every dismissive glance, every thinly veiled insult through this new, devastating lens. The professional critique she had leveled against Thorne for his perceived lack of discipline now felt like a profound betrayal, a brutal rejection of her own flesh and blood. She had, in her unwavering commitment to military impartiality, inadvertently inflicted a deep wound upon her own son. The resurrection was not just about Thorne's emergence as a capable soldier. It was about Anya's own rebirth as a mother, a role she had long ago abdicated in favor of her military career. This duality was agonizing. How could she reconcile the steely, unyielding General Petrova with the mother who had failed to recognize her own child, who had treated him with such relentless disdain? The battlefield, in its brutal honesty, had stripped away the artifice, forcing her to confront the raw, unvarnished truth of her life. Furthermore, Anya began to examine Thorne's actions, not just through the lens of military effectiveness, but through the emergent understanding of familial connection. His quiet endurance, his meticulous attention to detail, his almost instinctive ability to anticipate danger. These were not merely soldierly attributes, but traits she recognized from his father, a man of quiet intellect and profound observational skills. Thorne's perceived awkwardness, which she had once interpreted as a lack of confidence, now seemed to her like a manifestation of a deep-seated introspection, a thoughtful consideration of his surroundings that she now understood was not a weakness, but a unique strength. His silence, once a source of frustration, now echoed with the unspoken history they shared. This familial connection added a layer of profound emotional weight to her assessment, transforming her professional obligation into a deeply personal imperative. She was no longer just evaluating a soldier, she was confronting her past, her choices, and the enduring, undeniable bond of motherhood. This internal revelation was the true resurrection, a painful but necessary shedding of her old self, paving the way for a more authentic and integrated existence. Now consider how this applies when you face a situation where your initial judgment of an individual has been so firmly established that any evidence to the contrary is actively dismissed. Anya's entire operational paradigm had been built on the principle of objective assessment, devoid of personal sentiment. The revelation of Thorne's parentage directly challenged this fundamental tenet, forcing her to integrate the personal into the professional in a way she had never anticipated. The quiet competence she had finally begun to acknowledge in Thorne now resonated with a deeper, familial significance, transforming her professional admiration into a profound, maternal recognition. This internal seismic shift was the true resurrection, a painful but ultimately liberating rebirth of her identity, forcing her to embrace the complex tapestry of her life where the roles of general and mother were irrevocably intertwined. The weight of this newfound knowledge settled upon General Anya Petrova like a shroud, transforming the operational return into a deeply personal pilgrimage through the wreckage of her past. The return with the elixir was not a triumphant march, but a hesitant, almost fearful re-entry into a world irrevocably altered by the revelation of Elias Thorne's true identity. The elixir she carried was not a tangible boon, but a complex, volatile mixture of maternal guilt, professional humility, and a nascent, yet powerful, hope for reconciliation. Her previous interactions with Thorne, once viewed through the sterile lens of military assessment, now replayed in her mind with a painful clarity, each instance of her harshness amplified by the visceral understanding of their shared blood. The very discipline she had so rigorously enforced now appeared as a deliberate, unconscious rejection of her own son, a desperate attempt to distance herself from a past she had tried to bury. This internal turmoil made the return to the barracks a fraught experience. The familiar routines, the crisp salutes, the impersonal efficiency of military life now felt like a fragile facade, a thin veneer over the profound personal truth she had uncovered. She observed Thorne with a new intensity, not as a subordinate officer, but as a stranger who held the key to her own forgotten history. His quiet resilience, his meticulous attention to detail, his understated competence under fire, these were no longer simply admirable soldierly qualities, but echoes of a lineage she had tried to disown. The elixir was the burgeoning understanding that her son possessed a strength of character, a quiet fortitude that mirrored qualities she herself valued, and perhaps had unintentionally cultivated in him through her very distance. Furthermore, the elixir contained the bitter draught of professional consequence. Anya recognized that her prior treatment of Thorne, fueled by ignorance and prejudice, could have had catastrophic repercussions. The battlefield had, by sheer chance, revealed his capabilities before her misjudgment could lead to his demise. This close call underscored a critical vulnerability in her leadership. Her reliance on ingrained assumptions had nearly blinded her to the very qualities she sought in her soldiers. The elixir thus also represented a profound lesson in the fallibility of even the most seasoned judgment. The battlefield had served as a crucible, not only for Thorne's mettle, but for Anya's own capacity for self-reflection and adaptation. She understood that the true strength of a leader lay not just in their ability to command, but in their willingness to question their own perceptions, to embrace the unexpected, and to acknowledge the multifaceted nature of human capability. The elixir was this hard-won wisdom, a recognition that the most effective leadership often required looking beyond the superficial, beyond the labels and the perceived deficiencies, to uncover the hidden strengths that lay beneath. Now, consider how this applies when you face a situation where your initial judgment of an individual has been so firmly established that any evidence to the contrary is actively dismissed. Anya's professional identity, so meticulously crafted, was being fundamentally reshaped by the personal revelation of Thorne's identity. The elixir she brought back was not a weapon or a strategic advantage, but a deeply personal truth that demanded integration. Her military prowess, her unyielding discipline, had been built on a foundation of objective assessment. However, the presence of her son within her command forced a radical reimagining of what objective truly meant. It was no longer enough to assess a soldier's performance. She now had to contend with a shared history, a familial connection that imbued every interaction with a profound emotional resonance. The elixir was the understanding that true leadership, true strength, often lay in the ability to reconcile the personal and the professional, to acknowledge the human element that underpins even the most rigorous of systems. The quiet competence she had finally begun to recognize in Thorne was now illuminated by the profound realization of their shared lineage, transforming her professional acknowledgement into a deeply personal acceptance. This integration of disparate facets of her life represented the true essence of the return with the elixir, a potent blend of hard-won wisdom and the promise of a future forged in honesty and reconciliation. A future where the formidable general and the understanding mother could finally coexist. Reflecting on this journey so far, the intricate tapestry of command, misjudgment, and the unforeseen unveiling of deepest connections has begun to reveal its emergent pattern. The harsh realities of the operational theater, a crucible of immense pressure, have served not merely to test the mettle of those involved, but to fundamentally recalibrate perceptions, exposing the profound limitations of even the most rigorously honed assessments. The stark contrast between initial assumptions and the lived experience of conflict has illuminated the subtle yet powerful ways in which deeply ingrained biases can obscure an individual's true capabilities and inherent worth. In light of these insights, the path forward becomes clearer, not in terms of a definitive answer, but in the profound recognition of the questions that now demand our attention. The landscape of leadership, once perhaps perceived as a clear, defined terrain, now reveals itself as a far more nuanced and complex territory, one where the most significant discoveries often lie hidden beneath the surface of apparent mediocrity or overt strength. The very fabric of expectation, so carefully woven, has been challenged by threads of unexpected resilience and quiet competence, suggesting that the most critical battles are often waged not on the external front, but within the internal landscape of one's own convictions. As we pivot towards the final reflection, consider the cumulative effect of these interwoven threads. The slow, almost imperceptible erosion of certainty, the gradual dawning of a more comprehensive understanding, and the undeniable weight of responsibility that accompanies such revelations. It is akin to observing a vast, intricate mechanism where each component, initially dismissed as insignificant or even flawed, is revealed to possess a crucial, interlocking purpose. The echoes of past actions, once confidently relegated to the realm of professional judgment, now resonate with a deeper, more personal significance, urging a re-evaluation of the very foundations upon which our perceptions are built. The journey has led us to a precipice, not of resolution, but of profound realization, where the true significance of the experiences shared lies not in the events themselves, but in the transformative understanding they have forged. The biting wind, a constant companion on the desolate frontier, had long since ceased to be a mere atmospheric phenomenon for General Anya Petrova. It had become a resonant echo of the internal climate she had navigated, a relentless force that had buffeted the rigid structures of her perception. The mission, a crucible of brutal clarity, had not merely tested her soldiers, it had exposed the profound limitations of her own deeply ingrained judgments. The revelation of Elias Thorne's true identity, a seismic shift that fractured the carefully constructed edifice of her professional life, had irrevocably altered the very definition of command. It was a truth that settled not like a comforting balm, but like a heavy, undeniable weight, demanding a reckoning with a past she had long sought to compartmentalize. The return from the contested zone was not a triumphant procession, but a somber procession through the landscape of her own fallibility. The elixir she carried was a complex distillation of maternal guilt, professional humility, and a nascent, fragile hope for reconciliation. The harsh realities of combat had stripped away the artifice, revealing the undeniable truth that her son, the product of a forgotten wartime liaison, had been serving under her command, an unwitting recipient of her relentless, dismissive gaze. Each reprimand, each curt dismissal, now replayed in her mind not as a necessary component of military discipline, but as a profound, unconscious rejection of her own flesh and blood. The discipline she had so rigorously enforced, a hallmark of her celebrated leadership, now appeared as a deliberate attempt to distance herself from a past she had tried to bury, a past embodied by the very son she had failed to recognize. This profound realization was not a gentle unfolding, but a jarring upheaval, forcing Anya to confront the inherent paradox of her existence. The formidable general, a paragon of strategic acumen and unwavering resolve, was also a mother who had, through a potent combination of duty and emotional suppression, failed to recognize her own child. The quiet competence she had finally, grudgingly, begun to acknowledge in Thorn, his meticulous attention to detail, his uncanny anticipation of danger, his steady presence amidst chaos, now resonated with a deeper familial significance. These were not merely soldierly attributes, they were echoes of a lineage she had long attempted to disown. The battlefield, in its unforgiving honesty, had served as the ultimate revealer, exposing the profound disconnect between her professional persona and her personal truth. The elixir was this hard-won wisdom, the understanding that true leadership was not merely about issuing orders, but about the capacity to see beyond the superficial, to acknowledge the multifaceted nature of human capability, and to integrate the personal with the professional, even when the two seemed irrevocably at odds. The true practice begins now, not on the battlefield, but in the quiet, often uncomfortable space of personal reckoning, where the formidable general and the seeking mother must learn to coexist, forging a new understanding from the fragments of a shattered past. The enduring impact of this journey lies not in the tactical victory achieved, but in the profound and ultimately liberating recognition that the most critical battles are often those fought within the landscape of the self, where the truest strength is found in the courageous embrace of vulnerability and the unwavering pursuit of truth, even when that truth is deeply personal and profoundly challenging.